Hey everyone, Sam here, also known as Mr. Stainless001, and today I've got a video for you that I'm actually pretty excited about. So since before For Honor released, there has been a big conversation happening all over the internet talking about who would win in the setting that For Honor proposes, the Knights, the Samurai, or the Vikings. Now, this conversation has evolved to talking about the combat capabilities of these cultures, from their weapon types and strength to their ability to pierce mail armor to the types of armor they would have had. A number of YouTubers have created videos tackling these topics and tackling the topic of who would win between the Knights, Samurais, and Vikings with varying degrees of factual basis, from Game Theory's video that has been more or less, I think, slated by most people online, to Scalagrim, who took a much more detailed look. The one thing though that is recurring in the comments and in these videos is that, with all due respect, most of us who are commenting on this topic and who are making videos talking about this topic have very little to zero factual and historical knowledge of the time. I decided it was time for me to weigh in on this topic as well, but rather than just sharing my own knowledge or what I know about these cultures, I thought I would instead go to the people who do know. Today we're talking to Dr. Roderick, who is a Cultural Engagement Fellow at the Centre for the Study of the Viking Age at the University of Nottingham. We're going to be discussing a few topics, from how the Vikings would have reacted in the narrative setting of For Honor, to what armour they would have used, to how effective their weapons would be in piercing mail armour. I'll leave timestamps in the video description though, in case you want to watch back this video and jump straight to certain sections. Before we get into the video though, if you want to continue chatting about this topic or join the community here on the channel, there is a link to my Discord server in the video description. I'm in there every day chatting with you guys. With that said though, let's get into the video, and we'll begin by getting to know a little bit more about Roderick's recent research into Viking berserkers, as well as one major aspect of Viking dueling that didn't make it into the final game. Enjoy. So, I mean, with your thesis, I guess for somebody that would know nothing about Vikings, what would you say is a Viking berserker? How would you describe that to somebody?
I concluded that Old Norse berserk, the word from which we get modern berserker, just means champion.
Okay.
As in, like, King Arthur's knights were his champions, or Charlemagne's knights were his champions. They're guys that would fight formal duels on his behalf, and they would be his personal bodyguard.
Yeah.
In the Viking Age, there's probably something pagan too, you know, because there's an association with Odin. But anybody starts talking about shamanic warriors, all the rest of it, I'm like, yeah, okay, just calm down.
Yeah.
Because you haven't got the evidence for that at all. You can very clearly say these guys function within a particular sphere of influence.
Yeah.
But you cannot say that they were priests of Odin, as some people have tried to say, or any of the rest of that. You could say they might be expected to have greater influence because they, I guess, honour Odin more.
Yeah.
You know, because they're the guys that actually do the fighting and things.
Yeah.
But we haven't really got the evidence for that even. No. This is kind of going into more speculative areas.
Yeah.
So that's what I think. They didn't go nuts, so that's the simple answer. Even the literature doesn't actually support the idea of them actually going berserk in the modern English sense of the word.
Yeah.
When you start reading it read the berserksganga, the bit that's always translated as going berserk, always happens before the fight in the literature, but there can be intervening things, like in Egil's saga. Egil and Ljótur, the Pale, are having a scrap, are about to have a duel. Ljótur does the berserksganga, the supposedly going berserk thing. Then they have a poetry slam. There's a bit of extemporized poetry, and there's this huge break where they're trading poetry, and Ljótur loses because his poetry just ain't good enough. Intimates the end result of the fight.
Yeah.
That is not somebody that's actually gone berserk. That's not somebody that's out of control.
No, not at all.
So for me, this whole going berserk thing is more like a Maori haka.
Yeah.
like the All Blacks would do before a rugby match.
Yeah.
It's posturing, and it might have had religious significance, magical significance, whatever. Things that we cannot know.
Yeah. I,
So
I mean
that's
that.
me.
Yeah, that in and of itself is incredibly interesting because I guess from what we see in pop culture, from what we see in video games, TV, film, you would never picture Vikings exchanging poetry before they have a duel. I mean that image in and of itself is so bizarre when compared to, I guess, what we're led to believe about them as a culture.
Yeah, but
Um,
that's what the medieval people that wrote the sagas down believed the Vikings did.
yeah, I've got a few questions for you, obviously,
Yeah,
and I'm going to start out probably with probably what will be the trickiest kind of question to ask, which may not be the best way to start, and then we'll kind of refine that into talking more about them as warriors and,
yeah.
and technology and things. But I guess the most vague question and the most speculative question that I can ask you and that we can start off with to get it out of the way is actually talking about the setting of the game. And I think I touched upon this slightly with you in the emails, and that basically For Honor proposes this narrative that there's been a natural disaster, earthquakes, everything. The ground turns over, farmland is destroyed, water is in short supply, and that's what drives these three cultures to, I guess, clash. For me, what I would find interesting in that is because I guess I know very little about the factual Viking culture and how the Viking society worked. If something of that scale and that magnitude happened, what kind of impact might that have to Viking society and the way that their hierarchy runs? How would the glue that kind of keeps them together, what would happen to them?
That is a difficult question, really. I've been thinking about this. I think you might actually look at it in terms of the reasons given for the Viking Age starting itself. It's been suggested that overpopulation in the Viking Age caused young men to look abroad for wives. We think that Vikings had a certain amount of polygamy. And you read about in the sagas about kings having multiple wives. So recent research has suggested that young men went abroad because they couldn't get wives at home because all the rich guys at home were taking the wives. So they would do that. They'd go abroad to make their name because honor was important and a good reputation was important. So if you've got to go abroad and fight that way, especially if there's the pressures at home that stop you from making your name at home. So if you have like a natural disaster, and I'm going to have to be a bit speculative
Of
here,
course,
obviously.
Of course. Yeah.
I would suggest that you're likely to see sort of kings emerging, and you're either going to get a breakdown into local warlords who are going to gather people around them and protect their own, or you're going to see things coming together more and possibly a king gathering around him a bunch of hardy warriors and basically using this as an opportunity to take control and to make sure that he's got everything that he's got. On a much, much smaller scale, it's worth thinking about Iceland after the settlement, where anything that drifted up on the beach was actually important supplies. Lack of wood meant that driftwood was important. In terms of food, if a whale beached, that became a very important food resource. And we read in the sagas about Vikings having massive fights over who's got the rights to actually carve up this whale and keep the meat. So I think we do, from history, have an idea of what's likely to happen if resources are in short supply that way. And in a quite specific Viking context.
To kind of bring it back into For Honor again. In the game, we often see Vikings running into battle wearing nothing but a pair of trousers, maybe a couple of little bits of a few straps, a little bit of like fur or hide armor, but mainly showing off lots of skin, lots of muscles, hardly armored at all. 2 questions. How accurate, and I kind of know the answer to this question already, but how accurate is that? And also, if I was to stand in front of a Viking who was going into battle, what would I be most likely to see him wear?
That would depend on his social status, for starters.
Yeah.
In discussing this, it's important to remember that the Viking Age was 300 years.
Yeah.
So at the start, you get one lot of fashions. At the end, fashions and technology have changed a bit, and you get a slightly different look to it.
Yeah.
Basically, he would be wearing some kind of tunic, probably quite brightly coloured, because despite what the TV show Vikings shows, they're not really hipsters in horse skin. They would wear linen underclothes, which would most likely be undyed, because with the technology they had, linen wasn't easily dyed. So you'd be looking at kind of creamy whitish underclothes. And then they would have woolen tunics, which would be much brighter, and the range of dyes they have is it's incredible what you can do with just vegetable dyes.
Yeah.
And if they're wearing their best clothes, their newest clothes, you will see some very bright yellows and oranges and reds, blues, greens. Something bright like that. Yeah, it would probably have tablet woven bands around the wrists, around the base of the tunic, around the neck of the tunic, giving it some decoration. Trousers would be much the same, woolen. Shoes would be leather, plain leather. That's the kind of things that's the basic outfit.
Yeah.
On top of that, you might have leather or padded tunic, possibly. Don't really know. We haven't got the evidence for that.
Yeah.
If he's a wealthy warrior, he'll have a coat of mail over the top. It would be sleeveless in the early period at least, and probably only down to just below the waist.
Yeah.
Later period, you get longer coats of mail appearing. He would have a shield. You might see, and I'm going to get speculative here, a group of men from the same place might have got their shields all painted the same colours, because you mix up a batch of paint and you do everybody's at the same time. But also that's a sort of marker of social cohesion.
Yeah.
People wearing similar clothes. We only have one almost complete Viking Age helmet, and from this we think that possibly helmets were rare, possibly they weren't actually considered to be important enough to put into a grave, and therefore were just sort of reused and passed down through the years, whatever. The helmet might have spectacles like the Yarmanbu helmet.
Yeah.
It would probably have a nasal going down, running down the nose. It would probably have quite thick eyebrow decoration on it. Almost certainly would have a spear. A spear is absolutely the most common weapon imaginable.
Yeah.
So, your Viking will be there with a spear. If he's wealthier, he'll have a good quality sword, richly decorated. He might have a one-handed axe, which could well be the same axe he uses for chopping timber if he's poorer.
Yeah.
So that's the basics of it. And he would, if he's wealthy, he'll be wearing all his gold and finery, because you're going to go into battle looking your best.
Yep.
It's a display. The Vikings are very much about conspicuous consumption. So you want to look impressive. You want the gold. You want the bling. You want the helmet with sort of all these scary bits on it. The spectacles, so you can't really see the eyes. And you want to look as fearsome and as impressive as possible.
Yeah.
He would also be very well groomed as
Yeah.
well. Um, the idea that Vikings have this really long hair and big, thick, bushy beards
Yeah.
is not really quite right. They're much more likely to have, from what images we do have, to have had well-trimmed beards,
Mm.
hair that only comes down roughly to sort of shoulder length,
Hmm.
and he might even be wearing makeup. We know they wore makeup,
Wow.
so a bit of black eyeliner.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly how that was worn, we just know that they did. Floki in the Vikings series possibly goes over the top with the eyeliner,
Yep.
but but we know that they wore makeup.
Yeah.
Uh, they weren't filthy savages at all. These were guys that were quite fashion. Fashion was important to them. Looking
Yeah.
good was important to them, and we even have a letter from from England at this time complaining that the Vikings were seducing all the Anglo-Saxon women because they actually bathed regularly and
Wow.
combed their hair. I mean, another part of that is that the Old Norse word for Saturday is Laugardagar,
Hmm.
which means literally bath day.
Wow.
The image you see in For Honor is absolutely a fantasy Viking.
Yep.
I mean, my 13-year-old self says that looks really cool,
Yep.
but it's not what a Viking would look like.
Yeah.
It's very much a pop culture Viking.
Absolutely. I mean, it probably wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that Vikings were almost the pretty boys of the battlefield, really. From
It has been
with
suggested.
yeah, with their kind of perfume and clean clothes, and which is completely opposite to how they're being portrayed most of the time. I think it probably wouldn't be too much of a stretch, and you might agree with this in that the way that we see the Vikings is probably more based on, as you said earlier, that medieval pop culture, or your kind of the knights pop culture, in that we see them as being these big scary guys, when in actual fact they were well dressed, well groomed, well cared for,
And still big
warriors.
scary guys.
And still big scary guys. Yeah, they had the
Yeah.
best of all worlds, really.
Yeah.
So this kind of leading on slightly from what we've been talking about. One of the main arguments that I see being put forward about this whole topic online is the ability for the likes of the samurais as well, but in this case the Vikings, the ability of the weapons of the Vikings to pierce mail and plate armor. So knowing that the Vikings themselves, if they were wealthy enough, would have worn mail armor into battle, again, we could probably assume what the answer is here, but would it have been possible for a Viking warrior to pierce mail or plate armor, say, of a feudal knight in mainland Europe?
Mostly I would say that when people talk about piercing the armour, it's a nonsense.
Hmm.
Obviously, depending upon certain technologies, such as later war picks that are specifically designed for that purpose.
Yep.
It's, again, we go back to Old Norse literature, there's a lot of descriptions about people getting stabbed in the armpit or in the groin.
Mm.
Basically, people are not trying to actually pierce the armour, they're looking for a way around it.
Mm-hmm.
So the average Viking spear will not go through mail armour,
Mm-hmm.
unless it's badly made
Yeah.
or there's holes in it. You know, the Viking swords, ditto, it won't go through the mail armour. You
Mhm.
will be looking for vulnerable points.
Yeah.
This isn't about brute force, this is about skill.
Yeah.
Looking for vulnerable points to attack. Don't know to what extent sword or an axe would probably... With an axe, you could probably go through the armour,
Yeah.
particularly one of the bigger ones that you see later on.
Mhm.
An axe might well actually be sufficient to cut through a helmet.
Mhm.
Good bit of weight and a lot of swing behind it. But then, if you do that and you miss, you're leaving yourself wide open. And again, this isn't your film Vikings
Mhm.
who, with their staged battles where you're blocking with the sword and everything. These guys will actually be fighting very cannily. They'll be looking for the openings, the opportunities. They'll do things like they'll go for the legs, which aren't protected. Onan Treefoot had his leg chopped off in a fight, for example. And he was called Treefoot because he propped himself up on a stump to finish the fight.
Fantastic.
So, the wounds that we see being inflicted in the sagas are probably the kinds of wounds you would expect to see in battles. A lot of head injuries, especially if people are only wearing like a leather cap. And other than that, the injuries are going to be to unprotected areas.
Yeah.
When you talk about Viking berserks, there's actually a motif that you see regularly in the sagas where they have to actually be. They can't be hurt by iron. They have to actually be beaten to death with clubs.
Wow.
And I would suggest that that is probably because they're wearing flexible armour that can't be cut, but you can still cause blunt force trauma if you're using a club.
Yeah.
When you're actually thinking about that, there's a description in the saga of Olaf the Saint where Thorir Hundr, Thorir the dog, is wearing what's either a wolfskin armour or reindeer armour, depending upon which manuscript you read it in, because there are differences between the manuscripts.
Yeah.
And it specifically describes the Battle of Stiklestad, where he cannot actually be wounded, where he's got the armour, and yet he's got wounds on his hands.
Yeah.
Because he can only be wounded where he's not covered by this armour.
Would that have been? Would he have simply just been wearing a suit of mail, or would it have been something more than that? Do you think?
Well, it specifically says that it's an animal pelt. It's wolf skin or it's reindeer skin. The saga says it's magical, which I think you can reasonably safely discount.
Yeah.
But that suggests that he's wearing a jacket made from a pelt. So again, when you see them wearing when you see a Viking in the popular culture depictions wearing a wolf skin pinned across his back, it's not really that convincing to me. One of the arguments against berserks wearing bear skins is they're too heavy, and again, I'm just left thinking, well, no, they had tailoring skills, they had leatherworking skills.
Yeah.
They don't have to wear it as a whole animal pelt.
Yeah.
They can wear it. They could trim it. They could wear it as, a jacket, or it could be adapted, and especially with something like a bearskin, which is very hard to cut anyway.
Yeah.
It would make very good armour, but you could be beaten to death with the hammer end of an axe, for example.
Yeah. So, one question. Again, I believe I know the answer to this, but just for the record, so I know I've asked it, so that we know we have an answer on it. Did the Vikings utilise archery in battle?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. Absolutely. We know for a fact that they used various missiles. We've got words for slings, we've got Old Norse words for javelins, and we know they had bows. In the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, there is a Viking bow actually on display. It's about 6 foot tall, and I don't know what the draw weight of it is or anything like that, or how they would have drawn it, whether they'd have drawn it to the chest or to the ear, but we know that they used them, and we know that they were probably considered a prelude to the proper battle.
Okay.
We don't know precisely how they would have been used. We don't know whether it would be archers behind the main shield wall firing over the top of it, people skirmishing on the flanks of the army, or any. We don't have any detail about how they would have used it, but yes, they had bows.
Yes. So leading on from that, did the Vikings have siege technology?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Descriptions of the siege of Paris describe them actually using catapults. So they had siege technology. They adapted, and they used what they found along the way, what other people had. They didn't. What people forget is that they were part of Europe. They didn't exist in a vacuum somewhere just shuffled off to one side. So they had the access to the technology and the knowledge of everywhere they travelled, and they travelled as far as Byzantium in the east. We know that they had contact with India because there's a Buddha from India that was found in Birka in Sweden.
Wow.
We know that they had contact with Baghdad, so the caliphate in the Middle East. They had access to all of these different cultures, and we know that they were very good at adapting what they found. So it shouldn't actually be that surprising that they had catapults at the Siege of Paris.
Yeah. So, Roderick, my final question for you, and it's kind of simply just your personal opinion, but if you were to see these three, I guess, separate cultures clash with Knights, Samurai, and Viking, obviously we can assume you're probably going to be slightly biased towards the Vikings, but if you were to see the Knights, Samurais, and Vikings fight against one another, in your personal opinion, who do you feel would come out on top?
I think that would actually depend on which one has the better bureaucracy.
Interesting. Why do you say that?
Because your Viking army might win the battle, but you've got to try and win the war, and winning the war is about logistics, supply. It's about getting to the right place with the right people. And of the three, I don't really know enough about Japanese culture and warfare to comment with any great authority on it, or even any level of authority, to be honest. But I think that they had the structures in place for the broader command and control. The knights that you see in For Honor, they would have very similar sort of broader structures, and it would very much depend, for the Vikings, it would very much depend upon which period of the Viking Age you're talking about, and how stratified society had become at that point. Because obviously Viking Age society developed into medieval society, Vikings became knights. And so I don't think that the Vikings as depicted in For Honor would come out on top in this one, because winning one battle isn't enough. Between the samurai and the knights, I wouldn't choose to pick one because it would be way too speculative.
Sorry, go ahead, Roderick. Sorry, I cut you off.
But yeah, it just comes down to the ability to send orders to the right place at the right time and get people marching in the right direction and make sure that they're fed.
Well, folks, that is today's video. I hope you've found it interesting, to say the least. I will be trying to have a discussion with more historians over the coming months that specialise in medieval, Central European and Japanese history, so that we can get a better understanding of those two cultures. But in the meantime, why not let me know what you thought of today's video down in the comments below. Until next time though, I hope you're all having a great week, and I'll speak to you soon.